Hey everyone, so it's Hearth and welcome back to my channel. On today's video, we're talking about witch marks and how people in the British Isles historically protected themselves against witchcraft. The history of witchcraft is something that has always fascinated me, and I've had the great fortune of visiting many locations that are really significant in documenting that history. And one thing that is really highly documented are witch marks, protective symbols that were designed to keep witchcraft and the witches that cast it at bay. This is a really fascinating part of history for me, and I really wanted to share just a little bit of it with you today. Before we talk too much about witch marks, some context about the time period and the different characters in play is really important. Witch marks were really commonplace during the early modern period. This was a time where everyday people believed in both witches and witchcraft. This was also the time where the Scottish and English witch trials were taking place, and so many people were really scared of witches and the witchcraft that they could cast, and they were willing to take precautions against this malefic magic. I think it's really important to mention here that there are two different players when it comes to magic during this time period. We have the witches, and then we have the wise folk, the cunning folk, the peddlers. And these are really two different kinds of magical practices. One thing to note here is that witchcraft in the 21st century is perceived very differently to witchcraft in the 16th or 17th century. The terms witch and witchcraft have been reclaimed, mostly because of the witch trials and the terrible things that happened to innocent people. Witches during this time period were typically not self-identified. Instead, it was the local community that referred to them and in some cases accused them of being a witch. Now, a witch during this time period was a negative, malicious magical practitioner. They could transform themselves into animals. They could cause harm, illness, or even death on children, adults, animals. They could cause crops to fail, your food to rot, your butter to not churn. They could cause plague, they could cause rain, they could cause drought. And essentially anything that happened negatively in a community could and probably would be blamed on a witch. And especially when the witch trials started, these people were often accused, brought in front of a court, they were often tortured to gain a confession, and many of them were either imprisoned or put to death by hanging because of the accusation of them being a witch. So during this time period, being a witch was not something that you wanted. And if you are interested, I do have a podcast episode on the Pittenweem witch trials, and you can learn a little bit more about the Pendle witch trials as well if you would like to know a little bit more about that. And that case is shocking. If you want me to talk about that in the future, let me know and I will do that. I do want to note here really briefly though, that it's believed that many of the people that were accused of witchcraft and of being witches were actually innocent people, simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were often very vulnerable, they didn't have people to stick up for them, and so they were often falsely accused. They essentially acted as a scapegoat to prove to the community that the illness, that the death, that the poor harvest wasn't their fault. It was actually the fault of this innocent person. The other group of magical practitioners were known by many different names depending on where you lived, including cunning men, cunning women, wise folk. They were also known as peddlers, among many other names. These were the magical practitioners who countered against the witches. So they would cast fertility spells, prosperity spells, protection spells. They would help protect crops and livestock. They would also help reverse the negative magic that we saw the witches casting, or the witches were believed to be casting. And this is where the names of several items we use today comes from, such as witches' ladders, witches' balls, and especially witches' bottles. Because remember here, the magic of the witches is what the magic of the cunning folk is designed to be countering. I think it's really important to have that understanding before going forwards, because a lot of people would consider witchcraft to be the same then and now, but there was a distinct difference. And many local people would actively visit wise folk and cunning folk as a way of gaining protection, and they would often be given money or services, or there would be some kind of trade going on there. So you would have the cunning folk working to counter the magic of the witches. And because of this fear of witchcraft and the counterance of witchcraft, we have witch marks. So what are witch marks? Witch marks are carvings. They're usually placed within buildings, whether they be for humans or for animals, as a first line of defense against witches and their witchcraft. They were usually placed there for one of two reasons. They were either used to repel witches and witchcraft, so to drive them away, or they were used to contain or confuse witches and witchcraft. Either way, they were designed to stop the individuals or the animals from being harmed or negatively impacted by witches and their magic. Most of the time, witch marks were created by the people who needed to protect that space. So they could be landowners, they could be farmers, they could be the people who lived in the house. Sometimes they were made by wise folk or cunning folk, the people who were countering witchcraft, or they were created under the guidance of these positive magical practitioners to protect against witchcraft. These were usually the first step in protecting against witchcraft, and if anything did get through, it was then when you start seeing the idea of witch bottles becoming more and more popular. Witch marks can be found in so many places up and down the British Isles, but they're primarily found within homes and also farm buildings. They're usually carved into the woodwork or the stonework of that property, but they can also be found in churches and also significant storage buildings like tithe barns. I will give some examples towards the end of the video. These witch marks are primarily found around liminal space. These are the in-betweens, places where it's believed that spirits and energies can come and go freely. These include mirrors, windows, doors, and chimneys. And so you'll often find that there are more witch marks around liminal spaces and in rooms where there's a lot of liminal space than there are in rooms where there's not so much liminal space. And this is a repeating theme that we see time and time again. Witch marks are commonly carved into window frames, window sills, sometimes even on the glass panes themselves. They are carved into the lintels of fireplaces, sometimes even inside fireplaces, and we'll also see them carved into the stonework outside of significant buildings, usually either side of main doors. You'll also find witch marks in buildings that contained animals. These were really important to protect, and also around children's furniture. You'll often see it on cots, and people to this day will still use these protective symbols on cots in areas where babies or small children will be sleeping. So we know where they are and we know what they do, but what do they look like? Witch marks can actually be really variable. It's a classification of protective symbol, and so sometimes you might look at it and think, that's just a scratch on the wall, when actually it's something much more significant than that. There are a few really popular symbols that you can find all over the country, so the next time you go somewhere old, have a look around and see if you can find some, and it's worth asking a guide if there is one, if there's any witch marks in the local area, because they're more common than you might expect. The first witch mark that you might find are pentagrams. Now today we associate pentagrams with Wicca and witchcraft, but historically they've been associated with many different traditions and religions. Within Christianity, they were associated with the 5 wounds of Christ. Within Wicca and witchcraft, they're commonly associated with the balancing of the elements. This symbol is also associated with Sir Gawain in the Arthurian legends and is found on his shield, and generally speaking, it's always a form of protection, and the same was considered during this time period. This one isn't as common as some of the others on this list, but you will see pentagrams sometimes on churches. You will also see them carved into significant buildings. And if you're out there in the wild looking for these witch marks on buildings, I would recommend looking up, as you'll often find many of these carved into woodwork or stonework fairly close to the ceiling. One of the most common forms of witch mark are daisy wheels. These are also known as hexafoils and flowers of life, and many of you will likely recognize this symbol. It is as popular today as it has been throughout history. This is a soulless symbol, and it's believed that it was designed to bring lightness in the dark. This symbol is found in woodwork, on stonework, on furniture. It was also found on lead tokens. These were a low-denomination coinage, which was often carried by pilgrims, and it's believed that this might have had a connection to its protective nature. They were also often left at wells and sacred sites. This is a symbol that you can find in huge numbers, and if you find a location that has witch marks, you'll often find dozens of daisy wheels. They were probably a fairly easy symbol to carve, especially if you did have a compass, you were able to create them perfectly. Now, the number of petals within a daisy wheel really varies depending on the location, and sometimes the daisy wheel might not even look that much like a daisy wheel because there's only a certain number of circles, but it is a really iconic symbol, and if you are looking for witch marks, this one you'll probably recognize before any of the others. The idea of the sun and light repelling the darkness is something that we see quite frequently in witch marks. We see this in overlapping circles. This is another form of witch mark that is less processed than a daisy wheel. They are several overlapping circles, but they usually aren't symmetrical, which also represents light in the darkness. You then also have concentric circles. These are also known as celestial spheres. They are a circle inside a circle, inside a circle, inside a circle. Depending on the size of the circle, you would typically have anywhere upwards of 3 circles inside circles. These were often placed in dark areas where light wasn't reaching. So these could be cracks or breaks in a wall, a particularly dark part of a room, and they were both a representation of light in the darkness, but also because they are a circle, it was used to represent the idea that there is nowhere for witchcraft to hide. Everything was out in the open. There are no nooks and crannies where it can squirrel itself away. Everything is exposed to the light. And so these symbols were also really popular. Probably the most famous of all witch marks are burn marks. Now at first glance you might think that this is just a candle that's been left against the wall for too long. It's just a normal thing. But in reality, these take a long time to make and they're very purposeful. Burn marks are created by holding a candle at an angle against woodwork for upwards of 15 minutes. The candle is then removed and the burnt, charred area of the wood is then carved out. The burn is then repeated again and again and again until a suitable depth is created within the woodwork. These were really purposeful and we often find them around areas that have a lot of liminal space. So if there is a fireplace, a window and a door, you'll often find more burn marks than a room that simply has a fireplace. And the burn marks are often centered around the liminal spaces. So if there is a large fireplace, there's probably going to be more burn marks around the fireplace than in the rest of the room. These are really easy to dismiss, but when you see dozens of them alongside other witch marks, you quickly realize that there's a little bit more to this than you might first think. While no one is 100% sure on why burn marks are protective against witches and witchcraft, there are a few ideas. The most popular we see across many different forms of witchcraft protection, such as witch bottles. That being that the act of killing something, such as bending the pins in witch bottles or burning that flame into the wood, is an act of killing. By killing something, you are transforming it into the spiritual world, which can act to protect you. A way of bringing lightness into the darkness of the spirit world, where lightness in the physical world can't necessarily help you. Now, no one is exactly sure if this is the real reason, but it's the idea that a lot of people are following at this moment. You'll often find many of these burn marks in a singular room or in a singular property, and it's believed that the more fearful of witchcraft you were, the more burn marks that you had, and oftentimes these burn marks aren't alone. They'll be working alongside other forms of protection. So it does appear as though the burn marks by themselves aren't necessarily enough to entirely protect against witchcraft. Maybe they just illuminate the space and so offer a little protection. They're often also found alongside daisy wheels, concentric circles, and some of the others in this list. A slightly different variety of witch mark comes in the form of witch webs. These are also known as meshes and slashes. They are a series of overlapping, crisscrossing lines that can often be confused as just being messy handiwork, when actually they are purposefully created, often being placed over hearth lintels or fireplace lintels, and these were designed to catch and contain any spell work or even spirits that were sent by a witch. There are other forms of protection symbols that are a little bit more religious in nature. I do think it's good to note here that the majority of the British Isles at this point was following some form of Christianity, and so we do see a blend of Christian religion on top of folk beliefs. This is something that we see across the country in many different areas of the world as well. When a religion comes in, it doesn't necessarily override the earlier beliefs. The earlier beliefs just end up mingled within the modern religion. An example of this kind of mark are V's, M's, and W's. These are known as Marian Marks, and it's believed that they're associated with the Virgin Mary. Depending on how you flip the symbol, it could be 2 V's that are crossed over one another, a W, or an M. So it can vary depending on where you are and the person that has created them. The idea behind these may have been the repelling of the devil or Satan by the belief in the Virgin Mary or the Christian faith. So it's a slightly different technique to what we've seen in other witch marks, but these are commonly found all over the British Isles, and it really depends on the religious beliefs of the people who created the mark. But you can sometimes find these in religious religious buildings as well. And then the last variety of religious witch marks in this list are known as Christograms. Now, Christograms are 6 lines that are crossed over one another to create almost a star shape or a snowflake shape. The top one of these is turned into the letter P. And they're commonly found in the southeast of England, often on chimney lintels, so they could be good to look out for depending on where you are in the country. These are just a few of many different varieties of witch marks up and down the British Isles. There are even some more unusual witch marks, such as shoe outlines. That's an interesting story in and of itself. But these are just a few of the many, and if you have the chance to go and find some, I would thoroughly recommend that you do. You'll probably also find some in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect them. So if you go to an old building, be on the lookout for some witch marks. I have, however, had the great fortune of finding some myself, either accidentally or I went purposefully to find them. 2 of the best examples that I have visited personally are at the Tithe Barn in Burton-on-Trent and also at Little Morton Hall, which is in Derbyshire? Shropshire. I'll put it on the screen. I can't remember where it is. But these are 2 locations that have lots of witch marks that you can find, but there are many others all around the country. I will leave some links in the description box of different places where you can look up witch marks close to where you are. But I will show you some examples of the places that I have been. So the Tithe Barn is a really interesting place. The land was owned in 1001, we know this, but it was probably owned a lot earlier. And there is a large tithe barn on this site that is around 60 feet in length. It is absolutely massive, and it looks very unassuming when you go into it, and I had no idea it contained witch marks until I went inside. There are 2 large entrance doors, and on the stone walls either side of both of these doors are more witches' marks than I have ever seen in my entire life. There are so many, and there are so many different types as well. There were lots of daisy wheels, but also some concentric circles, some V's, M's, and W's, and there are hundreds of them. Now, it wasn't very well lit when I went, so I had to go around with a torch, but there's even a few inside the barn as well. Now, a tithe barn was used to collect tithe. This was a certain percentage of the farmer's grain, crops, whatever it was that they were harvesting, that was given to the landowner. It's the equivalent of tax as we have it today. And all of this grain was stored within tithe barns. And so it was a very significant place that really needed protection. Because if you were to lose all of that harvest, that's a really big deal to everyone in that local area. The other place that I found them in was Little Morton Hall. Now, I had the chance to ask one of the guides if they could show me the witch marks, and they showed me some of them with a torch, and some of them really only are visible with a torch. Here you have daisy wheels hidden right up near the ceiling. You also have concentric circles and witches' webs, and they are dotted really in almost every room. You also have several burn marks dotted around, often in rooms with other protective symbols, and it may well have been that the people who lived within those rooms were particularly nervous of witches, and so there are a lot of burn marks and protective symbols. But this is a good place if you do want to see a variety of different witch marks. They're also primarily carved into woodwork instead of stone, so that's kind of a different variety of mark right there. If you're lucky, hopefully you'll be able to find somewhere that has burn marks near you. And if you would like some more resources on witchcraft history and witchcraft protection marks, I will leave some links to books in the description box. So with that being said, I hope that you did enjoy this video all about the history of witchcraft, and hopefully I will be able to do more of these videos in the future if you would like me to, so please let me know if you would like more videos on aspects of witchcraft history. I would love to do them. Let me know if you've been anywhere that has witch marks. I would love to know where you've been, and hopefully you will be able to give some inspiration and locations, preferably that are open to the public, where people are able to go and see the witch marks and also support their care as well. Because if we aren't careful, we're going to lose the witch marks that we have, and that would honestly be a travesty. If you did like this video, please give it a like. It lets me know that you enjoy this style of content. If you do have any questions, comments, concerns, video ideas, or just want to chit chat with the community, feel free to post a comment down in the comment section. And if you do enjoy the magical content on this channel or in this video, please hit subscribe. I post magical content every single week. So with that being said, I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous magical day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye! Okay. Hello. We are currently on filming session 2 of tonight. I have a massive script for this video. I mentioned it briefly in my Glastonbury Hall video that came out a few weeks ago. And I had people be like, yes, do that video. And I spent a few days scripting it, and now it's massive. So we're going to see how this goes. I obviously have this information in my head, but I need to refer back to this. I'm going to have to keep referring back to it. So I can feel my lipstick right here. I can feel it. I hate it. Okay. Am I okay? I don't know. Hey everyone, so it's Hearth and welcome back to my channel. On today's video, we're going to be talking about witch marks, historic protections against witches, against witchcraft. Okay, I didn't choose the title of today's video before right this second. Should I really learn to start giving my videos a title first before I film them? Yes. Will I learn? Probably not. So start as we mean to go on, eh? You can. Oh, fuck it. It's fine. Where am I going with this? I think it's really important going forwards to acknowledge. I think it's really important going into this. I think it's really important going into this to have that I've been trying to film that section for like 30 minutes. I kept butchering the burn mark section. I had to redo that section like 12 times. Oh, okay. Next. Oh, I have been sitting here for so long. Too long, some might say. Aren't you meant to like get up and look at something far away every half an hour? Isn't that the general consensus of what you're meant to be doing? Instead, I've been staring at a little PZ on my camera lens. That doesn't make any sense if you've never seen my camera lens. Camera lenses typically, at least mine anyway, they have like a bunch of letters and numbers around the edge of them. And I know that if I look at the PZ, which is one of many numbers and letters on my lens, I am looking in the right place. But looking at something that is as tiny as this PZ hurts your eyes. So I hope that is an enjoyable video for everyone. I really hope so, because I don't want to have to film it again. Because this one took me longer than the Sabbath video. What? Sabbath videos usually take me the longest, but this one was the hardest. So, okay, I'm going to go now. So I can sit somewhere with some back support. Oh, because I have no back support, because the back of the sofa is all the way over here. And I sit right on the edge. The uncomfortable edge. Okay, right, I'm going to go. Right. Bye.